that at least in the medium term and the short term, Lebanon will avoid a civil war and has managed to do so up until now. And I think the elements that have prevented it from collapsing are still there and strong enough to continue, provided, of course, and this will be the last point of my talk, provided, of course, that they get a certain amount of support from the American and European governments in their current endeavors to avoid war. Certainly, the doomsday scenario was on the minds of most Lebanese immediately after the explosion on October 19th. And the normally bustling streets of Beirut were eerily empty for 2 days, as many of the city's shocked residents felt it prudent to wait and see how what people were euphemistically referring to as the situation would develop. Right? Yet by Tuesday, which was October 22nd, life had basically returned to normal. Today, Beirut is once more a city of overflowing bars, happening cafes, thriving businesses, and log-jammed traffic. If you go out on a Saturday night in Beirut, it looks like Miami Beach. I mean, it's that intensely full of people out partying. Talk of civil war is no longer sort of on the top of people's minds, and it's restricted to those international media channels which haven't entirely forgotten about it in the wake of Hurricane Sandy and the American election and other things that have, captured their imagination since then. So barely a few weeks after the assassination of General al-Hasan, the Lebanese themselves have moved on and the threat of civil war seems to have receded. And what explains this? One popular explanation, I would say, emphasizes the memories of the devastating civil war that ended barely 2 decades ago in 1990. In this highly divided society, one unifying national idea can be heard over and over again, no matter who you talk to, that nobody wants to descend into the dark hole of sectarian strife that killed 100,000 people or more last time around. The Lebanese are only too well aware of the costs of civil war, both physical and financial. And I would argue that this might even be the more important element of this. The government has consequently, even under this sort of anti-American March 8th, they've consequently followed a consistent policy of dissociating Lebanon from Syria's chaos. Admittedly, the path has not been easy for the reasons enumerated before. But the official policy is one of dissociation, that Lebanon will not get involved in this. And the experience of the Lebanese civil war almost certainly plays a role in the mindset of the country's governing elite as well. Several of the political parties are led by men who were, in their past lives, leaders of militias and fought each other on the field of battle in the 15-year period from 1975 to 1990. So, for example, General Michel Aoun, pictured here on the right, and General Samir Jajak, pictured here on the left, had once led Christian militias into battle in the 1980s. Today, they each had their own political party in Lebanon's parliament. Aoun is part of March 8th, and Jaja is part of March 14th. Then there's Walid Jumblat, who is pictured on the upper left here, who is the powerful leader of the Progressive Socialist Party. He once led the Druze militia in the civil war and is famous for saving the cedars of Lebanon by putting mines around them during the war to prevent them from being destroyed. That's kind of his biggest accomplishment during the war, I would say. And even though he himself is, at the moment, probably one of the most popular politicians, or one of the most powerful politicians in Lebanon, and is considered to be a kingmaker of sorts. And though they both fought on opposing sides during the war, these men and others like them have subsequently spent 20 years working out their political differences in peaceful ways as part of a pluralistic democratic system, which, for all of its flaws, seems to have worked relatively well up until now. And so for now, it seems that they intend to continue doing so, but particularly since political power in Lebanon is linked with wealth, and the possibilities of enrichment in a society that's rebuilding itself from a civil war are still quite large. And actually, this was something that came up in a conversation maybe about 2 weeks ago, that if there is a new civil war, who's going to benefit once it's you know, at some point it will have to come to an end as well, right? And so you will have to have another period of reconstruction. Who's going to benefit from it? Well, downtown Beirut is owned by the Hariri family, so if there's another civil war, guess who's going to be making the millions and billions of dollars once, you know, if there is another civil war once we get to the cleanup stage. So that's also not in the interest of people who might not want Hariri to make more money than the family already has, right? So given all of this, the question comes up, is this balance sustainable, the balance that I just mentioned? And answering this question, and it requires a somewhat deeper analysis of the two opposing blocs that dominate the scene here, March 8th and March 14th. The fact that Hezbollah has its own army, right, while the others, at least officially, don't. This would give Hezbollah a significant advantage in the event of a civil war, and should it win such a conflict, hypothetically, as I mentioned, it would institute a Shiite Islamist regime aligned with Iran. And this is an outcome that none of the other parties want, whether or not they're really, particularly March 14th, but also some of the March 8th parties are not really thrilled with that idea either. So all of this adds to more weight to the argument against sectarian violence, that there are too many people interested in it not happening. And finally, Hezbollah itself actually has been noticeably restrained since the beginning of the Syria conflict, until actually this weekend. But all of this is counterintuitive because you would expect a strong ally of the Assad regime to do all it could to generate support for the Syrian government. But what the war means for Hezbollah is that it's no longer able to rely on arms shipments through Iran. So, because they'd gone through Syria traditionally. So so the war in Syria has actually meant that Hezbollah is militarily weakened, which means that it also has every interest in not exacerbating the situation. There are two final elements that are balancing out the situation in Lebanon, and the first of these is the Lebanese army. I mentioned before that the Lebanese army was relatively weak after the end of the civil war, and in fact this was one of the justifications for Hezbollah existing in order to protect, or so they say, to protect Lebanon from Israel. But since 2006, thanks to an infusion of weapons from the United States, the Lebanese army has actually become much stronger. And what was really interesting in the events of mid-October was watching how quickly the army was able to put down sectarian clashes throughout the country. So the second you had militias running out to burn tires, the Lebanese army was out there removing them and forcing the militias back into their homes and out of the streets. So, and in fact, the Lebanese army command came out and said that they, in what I think was a very interesting quote, they said that they will not allow the assassination of al-Hasan result in the assassination of Lebanon itself, and they've been actually doing a very professional job of ensuring that. And finally, I would say the element that is actually perhaps even more important in Lebanon's continued unstable stability is the fact that despite all of this, the economy is still growing. Up until 2011, it was growing at the rate of something well above 5% a year. Lebanon never experienced the mortgage crisis because they had a very smart central banker who, in 2002, outlawed the sale, trading of mortgage-backed securities. So the crisis of 2008 really didn't hit Lebanon from that side. It still has some of the most expensive real estate in the world. And there are also other factors driving the Lebanese economy's success. And even now, I mean, it's gone down considerably. I think it's in 2012 it grew maybe at 1.2%, but still it's not in recession. And there is still some hope that it will continue to remain above water. And so the essential point of this is there are a lot of people making lots of money in Lebanon, and they're not really interested in sectarian clashes and religious reasons leading to the loss of profits, basically. I mean, and so because I suppose you have the Lebanese are well known for being a merchant society, and perhaps that's what's kind of at the heart of their managing to avoid civil war up until now.